Welcome to the Introductory course in Apiculture. Your narrator and author is Gordon Townsend, former chairman of the Department of Apiculture at the University of Guelph. Beekeeping is possibly the oldest branch of agriculture. The keeping of bees is recorded as far back as the records of history. Inscriptions found on the earliest Egyptian tombs indicate that the Egyptians were well acquainted with beekeeping, and the sign of the bee appears to have been associated with royalty from the first dynasty of kings. We know that the Egyptian beekeepers practiced migratory beekeeping by moving them on barges up and down the Nile. Greek colonists carried bees with them wherever they went, and it was the arrival of the Europeans that brought bees to America and to Australia. The Babylonians used honey as peace offerings to their gods, as well as in medicines and as a food. In the Roman days, taxes were often levied in the form of beeswax. While the value of beeswax and honey has been recognized from pre-recorded time, it is only in the last century that the real value of the honeybee has been recognized, that of pollination of the many fruit and vegetable crops. The keeping of bees for the pleasure derived from their study and for the benefits and profits arising from their products has been an important vocation or avocation for many centuries, and there are now thousands who follow this pursuit. This course is of an introductory nature and is designed mainly for the beginner in beekeeping, and may be of some help to those who are contemplating entering the commercial field. Topics such as queen rearing and breeding, pollination, physical properties of honey, processing and packing of honey, the anatomy of the bee, tropical apiculture, and the history of beekeeping are only referred to. It is planned to cover these topics as special courses under an advanced apiculture program. The film strips in the audio section accompanying this course contain nearly 300 slides. These slides are chosen to emphasize each chapter and should be used along with each chapter in the text. The film strips and the slides are numbered from 1 onward for each chapter. The slides were obtained from many sources, but particular appreciation must be expressed to Dr. M.V. Smith of the Department of Environmental Biology, who provided most of the close-up pictures, particularly those of disease and normal larvae. The photographs taken in foreign countries were, for the most part, provided by the author while on assignment with his various international development programs. The author has tried to cover, as much as possible, the points which cause problems in learning to keep bees, as he can vividly recall the days when he started as a hobbyist and had to learn the hard way because no publications of this nature were available at that time. No matter how much you read, the only way to learn beekeeping is by actual practice. We will now start with Chapter 1, The Honeybee Colony, Film Strip 1, Its Inhabitants. The honeybee is a social animal, and therefore the colony as a whole is the important unit. The relationship between the various individuals within the colony is very important. It is therefore necessary to first learn to recognize the different individuals and have an awareness of their functions. A colony of honeybees during the summer period normally consists of 1 queen, slide 1, several hundred drones, slide 2, and anywhere from 10 to 60,000 worker bees, slide 3. Slide 4 shows the 3 together. The queen in this case is marked for identification. The queen bee is the only fully developed female. At the height of the season, she can lay about 1,500 eggs per day. She is attended regularly by a retinue of workers, slide 5. The pink mark is placed on her abdomen. In this case, to readily identify her for record purposes. The drone is a much larger bee, is male, and serves one purpose, that of mating with the queen. The workers, or immature females, are the important inhabitants of the hive, carrying out most of the duties, both in the colony and in the field. The queen can live up to several years, or at least as long as she can satisfactorily lay sufficient worker eggs. The drones are around the hive most of the summer and are driven out in the fall. The workers survive about 6 months during the winter period, being gradually replaced by young bees as the days lengthen in the late winter and the queen starts to lay eggs. But in the summer, they only survive for 4 to 6 weeks. Natural comb is built by the bees from wax with hexagonal cells to hold brood and honey. Slide 6. The queen lays 1 egg to a cell. Slide 7. But occasionally, in a queenless colony, some workers, called laying workers, develop the ability to lay a few eggs, often placing them more than one in a cell, in slide 8. The eggs hatch after 3 days and soon develop into larvae. Various stages of early development are shown in slide 9. Toward the end of the larval development, the cells are capped over, at which stage the larva stretches out in the cell. Slide 10. 3 types of cells are found. Slide 11 shows capped worker cells with 4 capped drone cells in the center. The drone cells are recognized by their raised appearance. Slide 12 shows worker brood just being capped over, 2 cells not yet finished. Queen cells are peanut-shaped. They hang down and are usually found in the lower part of the frame, slide 13, particularly if the colony is preparing to swarm. Film strip 2, reproduction. If the queen is failing and the bees have decided to replace her by a supersedure, a queen cell will be built near the center of the comb, slide 14. Slide 15 shows a queen larva in a new cell cup. Slide 16 is a queen larva stretched out in a cap cell. In a few days, the queen larva changes to the pupal stage, slide 17. And slide 18 is a worker pupa with the eye color beginning to show. In the text, you will find a life history table giving the various developmental periods for the worker, the queen, and the drone. After 21 days from egg laying, the young worker bee chews its way out of the cell, as depicted in slides 19, 20, and 21. The queen emerges in 16 days, and the drone in 24 days. In the northern hemisphere, the queen usually starts some laying during January and February, and this gradually increases as the days lengthen, until during May and June she is laying at a rate of possibly 1,500 eggs per day. This soon builds a very strong colony, ready to produce a crop of honey from the flowers that are available. At this time of year, unless control measures are used, it is normal for a colony of bees to reproduce by swarming. The colony will produce a number of queen cells. When these are about to hatch, the old queen will leave with about half of the colony. The swarm will normally settle nearby, possibly on a tree, as in slide 22. At this stage, the beekeeper can quite easily remove the limb and place the bees at the entrance of a hive containing combs, slide 23, and the bees will quickly enter the colony if the queen is present, as in slide 24. If the swarm is not collected, the scout bees will soon locate a suitable place for a new home, and the swarm will depart. In the old hive, a queen soon hatches. and usually destroys the other queen cells, as depicted in slide 25. A few days later, mates and starts laying her eggs and rebuilds the colony. When the days start to shorten and the weather becomes cooler during October and early November, the queen slows down in laying eggs. During the period of November and December, egg laying usually stops. In the more tropical areas, this does not follow the same pattern. Here the queen can continue laying throughout the year, provided there is sufficient nectar, pollen, and water available. And only during a dearth period of one or more of these materials will she cut back in her laying. During the winter period, the worker bees cluster and are mainly involved in maintaining the temperature of the colony to ensure that it satisfactorily comes through the winter conditions. When the weather is suitable, they fly and get rid of unwanted materials within the hive and void their feces. Older bees will sometimes be found lying in the snow, as in slide 26. Provided this loss is not too heavy, it helps to maintain a healthy colony. Film strip 3, the colony behavior. During the spring and summer, the activity of the worker bees is very great and follows a fairly definite pattern. The first 2 to 3 weeks of a bee's life is spent within the colony, progressively following various duties. The first duty of the worker bee is usually house cleaning. At the end of about 3 days, her food glands start to develop, and she starts feeding the older larvae. A few days later, she will start feeding the younger larvae as their glands gradually develop and change. At around 9 days of age, the wax glands start to develop on the abdomen, and the young adult can then become involved in secreting wax scales, as depicted in slide 27. And they participate in the building of the comb, or capping brood and honey, slide 28. Towards the end of the second week of her life, she starts to become involved in the handling of the food coming into the hive, and assists in receiving the nectar from incoming foragers, slide 29, and removing pollen from the legs of the pollen foragers. In manipulating the nectar around the hive, she adds invertase to the original predominantly sucrose solution, an enzyme which breaks it down into 2 simple sugars, dextrose and levulose. Considerable fanning takes place during this period, by which the water is removed from the nectar, concentrating it to the consistency of honey. Towards the end of the first 3-week period, the workers will take orientation flights from the hive and start to learn their location and to distinguish one hive from another. They will also start to participate in the fanning at the entrance, as in slide 30, to circulate air throughout the hive, and will also take part in guarding the entrance of the hive, slide 31. For the next 2 to 3 weeks, the honeybee will be involved in gathering food supplies, nectar, pollen, and water. The nectar is gathered from flowers, slide 32. In this case, the flower is catnip, very attractive to bees, but not grown in sufficient quantity to produce a surplus of honey. The pollen is collected from the stamens of the flowers and packed on the 2 rear legs of the bee, slide 33, in a special basket designed for this purpose, slide 34. The water is collected from a nearby stream or other source, slide 35, and carried back in the honey sac. In order to plug up the openings and thus protect the colony from weather or intruders, some bees will collect propolis or gum from trees and bring it back in their pollen sacs on their hind legs, slide 36. When not engaged in these activities, she will be active within the hive, helping to maintain the brood temperature and to secrete wax scales, slide 37. When engaged in these activities, she will be active within the hive, helping to maintain the brood temperature and to secrete wax scales, slide 38. at about 34 degrees centigrade. The heavy egg-laying of the queen during the summer period more than compensates for the loss of bees owing to their short life during the summer activities. This is one period of the year when the bees work very hard collecting and storing the necessary food to carry them through the balance of the year. The nutrition and development of the honeybee colony is of considerable interest. The food of the larvae is entirely different from that of the adult bees. The basic food requirements of the adult honeybee are honey and pollen. The honey is a source of energy and can also be converted into fat and glycogen in the body of the bee. Fat normally cannot be digested when taken as a food and is usually excreted. The adult honeybee can normally live for a long period of time on a pure honey diet, or even on a sucrose diet. The consumption of honey by a colony of bees is very high and has been estimated by various workers as being between 75 and 100 kilograms per year. About 25 to 40 kilograms of this is used during the winter period, the balance for brood rearing during the summer. The main sugar constituents of honey are glucose, fructose, sucrose, and maltose, all of which can be used satisfactorily by the honeybee. The honeybee requires carbohydrate energy, almost like an engine requires gasoline, and as soon as the honey supply runs out, the bee can no longer fly. A flying bee requires approximately 10 milligrams of sugar per hour. The drones require at least 3 times as much. While the honeybees may survive on carbohydrates alone for long periods of time, they cannot rear brood for any extended period at a time without having a source of protein. The hypopharyngeal glands in the heads of the worker bees do not develop unless a source of protein is available, and these glands must develop if they are to secrete the necessary food for the larvae. Pollen is a source of protein and must be made available either for the bees to collect when foraging or as a supplement placed on the hive during a period when no pollen is available. It has been estimated that approximately 145 milligrams of pollen is necessary to rear a single bee from the period of the egg hatching until it emerges as a bee. In order to maintain this large supply of protein, a colony will gather between 40 and 50 kilograms of pollen per year. This can be collected from many flowers, each with its characteristic color, as depicted in slide 37. Drones do not eat pollen, but are fed a food mixture of glandular secretions, honey and pollen mixed. The queen can live on a sugar mixture, but normally her food is the glandular secretion known as royal jelly. The larvae of the honeybee are fed on glandular secretions of the worker bees. The younger workers with the newly developing glands usually feed the older larvae intended to be worker bees, while the older developing workers feed the younger larvae. It is at this stage that the larvae intended to be either workers or queens are fed a glandular secretion which has been called royal jelly. After the larvae are about 3 days old, if they are intended to be workers, honey and pollen are also added to this food. If, however, they are intended to be queens, the glandular secretion of royal jelly is continued throughout its larval period. Pollens differ in their nutritional value as far as the honeybee is concerned. Unfortunately, the complete nutritional requirements of the honeybee are not yet completely known, and thus it has not been possible to prepare a complete pollen substitute. Many different formulae have been developed and recommended as a supplement for pollen, but in all cases it is advisable to add a portion of bee-collected pollen if it is to prove satisfactory. Since bee-collected pollen can be a means of transferring a number of bee diseases, particularly European foul brood, as shown in slide 38, and chalk brood, slide 39, care should be taken in the collection of this pollen to make sure that it comes from disease-free colonies. Heideck felt that a mixture could be used as a substitute for pollen, and he recommended soybean flour, dry brewer's yeast, and dry skim milk in the proportion of 3 to 1 to 1. This is incorporated into a sugar solution until it becomes dough-like. The formula is included in the text. However, most of those who have used the so-called substitutes feel that it is not really a substitute and is only suitable if 1 part in 5 of pollen collected by the bees is added to it. The pollen is collected in special traps, placed under the colony, and fed in a patty placed under wax paper on the top of the colony. The procedure for collecting will be discussed in more detail under management. We now come to Chapter 2, Species and Races of Bees. Film strip 4. To the beginner, quite often wasps and hornets are all looked upon as being honeybees. However, there are vast differences between wasps and bees, and between bees themselves, and the apiculturist should be able to distinguish between them. Wasps and hornets may be nectar collectors, or may be carnivorous, or both. Some nest in the ground, others build paper nests. Some live collectively, others live singly. Slides 1 and 3 depict wasps and bees. Since these slides are photographed from pinned specimens, they do not portray the characteristics as well as live specimens, but the comparison in size and shape is characteristic. Slide 1 shows 4 types of wasps. If you turn this slide on its side with the heads upward, the upper left is the yellow jacket. They are black and yellow in color. They nest underground, along house foundations, and any other convenient spot that they can find, and sometimes in the fall they can become quite a nuisance. The upper right is a bald-faced hornet. These are the ones that build the large, gray, football-shaped nests in trees, and they are very sensitive to disturbances. The lower left is the Plestes wasp. They are usually reddish-brown with stripes on the abdomen. The abdomen is spindle-shaped. They build a honeycomb-like nest under eaves of buildings. They are a particular nuisance around cottages. The lower right is the mud dauber wasp. The females of this build mud cells in any open, protected area, usually in garages or other buildings. They fill the mud cell with paralyzed spiders and then lay an egg and seal the nest shut. They are solitary wasps, but quite often a number of females will build together. Wasp nests can be very large and are very strong, particularly in the tropics, where they can become very dangerous. Slide 2 depicts one of the largest of these nests I have seen, located in Sri Lanka. It is approximately 5 feet long and 2 feet wide. The bees, slide 3, differ from the wasps by having forked body hairs and a vegetarian diet of pollen and nectar. The slides in this film strip will describe mainly bees other than the honeybee, Apis mellifera, which are used for honey production, because the Apis mellifera will be described in more detail throughout the balance of the course. Slide 3, if turned on its side with the heads up, depicts in the upper left the common bumblebee. The bumblebee is perhaps the largest of the bees, and they nest in holes in the ground, in old mattresses, or any other suitable protected spot. There are several species found in Ontario, but they all have hairs on both the thorax and the abdomen. A bee which looks very much like the bumblebee and is almost similar in size is the large carpenter bee, but it is rather uncommon in Ontario. The main distinguishing point between this bee and the bumblebee is that the carpenter bee does not have hairs on the abdomen, which is often totally black, although in Africa many variations in color appear. These bees are true carpenters in that they can drill holes in wood for their nesting. Such a bee is depicted in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. Right below it, in the lower right, is a honeybee for comparison with the other bees. Just below the bumblebee on slide 3 are 2 sweat bees. These bees nest in the ground and are attracted to the sweat of body perspiration. Since all of these bees collect pollen, they are very important for pollination, as compared to wasps and hornets, which usually use other insects and spiders to cover the protein portion of their diet. Asia has the greatest variety of honey-producing bees. The largest and most ferocious of these is Apis dorsata, or the rock bee, which builds a single comb colonies in the open under ledges, or on the limbs of trees. These combs can be 4 to 5 inches thick, where they are fastened to the limb. They stretch as much as 4 feet or more along the limb and hang down 2 to 3 feet. These bees migrate from one area to another and produce reasonably large quantities of honey. A search is underway at the present time to try and find ways and means of using these bees for honey production. Slide 4 depicts a group of these combs hanging in a tree, and slide 5 depicts an Apis dorsata worker gathering nectar. Apis cerana is the only bee used at the present time on a reasonably large scale in the southern Asian areas for honey production. These are relatively mild-tempered bees to work with and live on combs similar to Apis mellifera. The only problem is that colonies are quite small and they do not produce large quantities of honey. 10 kilo per year would be a good production. Slide 6 shows Apis cerana bees fanning at the entrance of the colony, and slide 7 shows an Apis cerana worker collecting nectar from mustard. Slide 8 shows one of the small colonies used for production of honey from these bees. In this case, the colony is in Sri Lanka, located in a rubber plantation. The only other honey-producing bee located in that area is Apis florea. This is a very small bee which builds a single comb, usually about 1 to 2 meters above ground, hanging on the limb of a tree. It is placed similar to the comb of Apis dorsata, as a single comb located in the open. Slide 9 shows one such comb, which in this case is rather large, as most of them are not much larger than the palm of your hand. One can see here where the honey is stored near the top, the brood in the center, the drone brood near the bottom, and the queen cells along the bottom. Slide 10 depicts an Apis florea working mustard. There have been many reports of the so-called killer bee from Brazil. This started out as a hybrid between African bees and the European bees which were in Brazil at the time it was introduced. But as it moved northward, this bee became essentially an African bee, carrying all of the African characteristics. Slide 11 shows a picture of one of these bees photographed in Brazil. The colored segments on the abdomen and the yellow scutellum, which is at the base of the thorax, are rather distinctive marks for African bees. A more detailed description of each of these bees will be found in the text. Before leaving this area of honey-producing bees, we should also look at two others, which have been used rather extensively in very early times, and even to some extent now, for honey production, particularly in Central and South America, before European bees were introduced. First is the Melipona, shown in slide 12. In this case, the young Melipona bee is crawling into a cell. Beside it is a honey storage cell. These bees were used extensively by the Indians before Europeans came to this continent. This little bee builds two types of cells, one quite large in which it deposits honey, and a smaller one for brood rearing. A smaller bee which nests in hollow trees is a trigona, shown in slide 13. This has been used in parts of Africa and Asia for honey production on a small scale. We now turn to Chapter 3, Honey and Pollen-Producing Plants. Details with respect to the value of these plants and their scientific names will be found in the text. Film strip number 5 depicts the major sources. Plants which produce honey can be divided into several categories. There are a few major ones upon which we depend for production of the crop of honey. There are others which will yield large crops occasionally, and there are others we are quite dependent upon to fit in during the various seasons of the year to supply extra food for the bees and also pollen. The major and minor honey plants will vary from province to province and country to country. The plant which was most responsible for the development of beekeeping in eastern Canada on a commercial scale during the early part of this century was sweet clover, as shown in slide 1. This plant was grown commercially for quite some time, and in the mid-30s could be found on almost every farm in Ontario and the eastern United States. Very large crops of honey were produced from it. In areas where the soil was a little more acid, the most important honey-producing plant was alsike, shown in slides 2 and 3. This was also grown extensively in the early part of this century to produce seed for export for the dye industry. In wet seasons in some areas, white Dutch clover is quite important and is depicted in slide 4. These three plants were the major sources of honey up until the end of the 1930s, along with buckwheat in some areas, particularly sandy soil sections, which is shown in the next film strip. In the early part of the 1940s, alfalfa was being used extensively on the farms and took the place of sweet clover, and soon became the major source of honey in Ontario. Two types of alfalfa are depicted in slides 5 and 6. Basswood, depicted in slides 7 and 8, in some years has been an exceptional producer of honey, especially in the early part of this century, during the first 1 or 2 weeks of July. This plant, however, is very dependent upon good weather during that period. In northern Ontario, one of the major sources of honey is fireweed, depicted in slides 9 and 10, along with alsike, which was depicted in slides 2 and 3 previously. In recent years, very large crops of honey have been produced in western Canada. One of the major sources of this honey has been rapeseed production. A field of rape in Saskatchewan is depicted in slide 11. Within recent years, birdsfoot trefoil has become quite popular as a farm crop, and is depicted in slides 12 and 13. There is still some question about the value of this plant for honey production. In some areas it seems to not yield at all, and in others it is reported as being a very high producer, particularly in northern Ontario. Film strip number 6, Occasional Major Sources. A number of other plants are minor sources of honey in almost every year, and, under good weather conditions, can produce a surplus, sometimes even can be the major source of honey. Slide 14 depicts a honeybee working dandelion, in this case for pollen, but quite often an extensive amount of nectar can be produced from this as well. It is an important source of supply for bees for both pollen and nectar during the early build-up period in May, and on a few occasions the very thick, dark honey must be extracted prior to obtaining the white honey if a surplus is produced. Goldenrod, in slide 15, in some falls can produce a full crop of honey. Occasionally, this has been the only source of honey in some areas in Ontario. It is always very attractive to the bees during the latter part of August and the early part of September, if the weather is correct. A plant which has produced large crops of honey in Eastern Europe, particularly Romania, is the sunflower, slide 16. This is now being grown in Western Canada to some extent and is also producing crops of honey. A plant which used to produce as much as 3 to 4 million pounds of honey a year in Ontario is buckwheat, slide 17. Unfortunately, this is not grown to the extent that it was in the 30s, and now does not produce near the quantity of honey that it did. So great was the crop from this in some areas that it was necessary to extract the white honey early so that it would not become mixed with the dark buckwheat honey. There are a number of other plants which do produce considerable amounts of honey under the proper circumstances, particularly when there is a large amount of bloom available. One of these is the star thistle, in slide 18. While this is not found extensively in Ontario at the present time, it is responsible for quite large crops in Michigan, where it is considered a bad weed, and is gradually spreading into Ontario. Slide 19 depicts a mixture of sow thistle and Canada thistle, taken in British Columbia, where it does in some years produce a reasonable quantity of honey. The Canada thistle itself is depicted in slide 20, and the sow thistle in slide 21. Both of these plants are minor sources of honey in Ontario in most years. One of the better sources of honey in parts of France and parts of England, particularly the chalk areas of the coast, is sainfoin, depicted in slides 22 and 23. This plant is grown to some extent in Ontario at the present time, and certainly does produce some honey, although it is not grown in sufficient quantity to be really of significant value for honey production. During the early part of the season, the apple bloom, slide 24, can produce a reasonable quantity of honey, and certainly where apples are grown, this can be of major value to the bees during the early build-up period in May. Another plant which has been responsible for large crops of honey in particular areas in certain years is the blueweed, depicted in slides 25 and 26. Honey and pollen-producing plants. Film strip 7, the minor sources. There are many minor sources of honey and pollen which are quite important to the honeybee. Hawthorn, as depicted in slide 27, is an important source for the rearing of brood during May. Pussy willow, in slide 28, is extremely important in the very early part of the spring, as one of the first sources of pollen. Aster, slide 29, which blooms during September, provides both pollen and nectar as winter stores. Hard maple, slide 30, is a very important source of nectar in the early part of the season. Catnip, slide 31, is liked very much by the honeybees and does have considerable nectar. If catnip had sufficient value for some other use which would justify large-scale cultivation, it could very likely be a major source of honey. It blooms over a long period of time and is visited constantly by the honeybees. Chicory, slide 32, is now a weed which grows rather extensively and is very attractive to honeybees for both pollen and nectar. It blooms over a long period of time and no doubt provides nectar during the interval between other major crops. Buckthorn, slide 33, a member of the rhamnus family, is perhaps more important in the production of honey than is realized. The variety Rhamnus frangula is a native of Ontario and grows rather extensively in some of the wetter areas. Recent information indicates that if the conditions are right early in the season, it can produce large quantities of honey, and does produce honey in smaller quantities throughout the season. Black locust, slide 34, which is a native of eastern United States, is responsible for very large crops of honey in Central and Eastern Europe. In some areas, it is their major source of honey. Slide 35 depicts a scene in Romania where hundreds of colonies of bees are moved into large black locust plantings where they call it acacia honey. There are many varieties of black locust. Some are very good honey producers, others are not. The one depicted in slide 34 is Robinia rosinskiana, which perhaps shows the greatest possibilities as far as Ontario is concerned. It has a very light, soft flower as compared to the others, and the bees work it quite readily. Unfortunately, in Canada and the United States, black locust is attacked badly by the locust borer, the adult of which is depicted in slide 36, which is laying eggs on the bark. When these eggs hatch out, the young larvae burrow into the center of the tree and tunnel as depicted in slide 37, thus weakening the stem, and it can be blown over quite readily in a high wind. Another plant which does produce reasonable quantities of honey in Ontario, New York State, and other areas is purple loosestrife, slide 38, found in wet areas and along edges of streams. The honey from this plant is reported to be dark in color and strong in flavor. Anise hyssop, slide 39, is reported to be an exceptionally good honey plant in some areas, and in Western Canada in the early part of this century was responsible for quite large crops of honey.
When you turn the cassette over to side B, there will be music until the narration begins. Please put the tape recorder into the fast-forward mode to the end of the tape now, before turning the cassette over to side B.
Honey and pollen-producing plants, film strip 8. Other sources and factors. Each country has its major sources of honey, some native and some introduced. In Australia, the major source is eucalyptus. There are many varieties of this plant which were native to Australia and introduced to other areas. One of the best sources of honey among the eucalypts is yellow box, depicted in slide 40. In Kenya, a good source of pollen, and also some nectar, is sisal. In slide 41, bees are depicted gathering pollen from the sisal. However, the major source of honey in the Miamba woodland areas of Kenya is the acacia, one of which is shown in bloom in slide 42. In Ethiopia, the yellow mascol, depicted in slide 43, is one of the major sources of honey in the Addis Ababa area. So widespread is this flower, and in such quantity, that it has been adopted as the national flower of Ethiopia. A relative of our native blueweed, which was introduced into Australia, is shown in slide 44. This is called Patterson's curse. This has spread rapidly over the ranchland areas and is producing large quantities of honey and pollen. Quite often, Australia is short of pollen because many of the eucalyptus trees do not yield any pollen at all, and this plant has taken its place. However, attempts are being made to eliminate it as it has become a serious weed. Another interesting source of honey is the honeydew honey, produced by insects. There are several types of honeydew honey. Some are produced by excretions from aphids. Others are produced by scale insects, such as the one depicted in slide 45, taken in New Zealand, where the scale insect is found on the bark of a tree. A major source of honey in England, Scotland, and Norway, and some other areas of northern Europe is the heather, depicted in slide 46. In many tropical areas of the world, Gliricidia is an excellent producer of honey. Slide 47 is a hedgerow of Gliricidia in Colombia, South America. A tree which is going to prove quite popular in the future in the dry zone areas of the tropics is Prosopis chilensis. It grows quite readily in areas up to an elevation of 1,000 to 1,200 meters and will survive in rainfall as little as 25 centimeters per year. It grows very rapidly and is a source of edible food in large quantities, as well as large quantities of honey. The tree depicted in slide 48 was introduced into Kenya and is 4 years old from seed. Another rather interesting source of honey, and one which is not known too well at the present time, is depicted in slide 49. These are the rubber trees of the tropics. It is a major source of honey in southern India and can be a good source of many other areas. This plant produces its nectar from extrafloral nectaries between the leaves, as shown in slide 49. Thus there are many sources of available nectar and pollen, some exploited, others not, but they are all dependent upon weather and soil conditions. Many beekeepers have made a study of the soil conditions in their area, and as a hedge against complete failure, have tried to establish their bee yards so that they are on several soil conditions and several climatic conditions. The soil areas of Ontario are shown in slide 50, and their descriptions in slide 51. Clovers grow best in the alkaline areas, particularly if they are reasonably well drained. Alsac grows best in some of the more acid areas, although it does grow well in the clay belt areas of northern Ontario. Slide 52 shows the soil superimposed over the various climatic areas. The climatic areas are described in more detail in the text. By combining these two features and selecting bee yard locations carefully, it is usually possible to avoid complete failures. We now turn to Chapter 4, Beekeeping Equipment. Film Strip 9, Early Beekeeping. From the earliest days of mankind, our forefathers were interested in bees and honey. So important was beeswax that taxes were often paid or demanded in wax and sometimes honey. Beekeeping equipment actually developed in a number of stages, each of which overlapped the other. The earliest records indicate that the first beekeeping was carried on by bee hunting, in which bee nests were hunted out either in cliffs as in slide 1, which is copied from a rock painting in a cave near Valencia, Spain, or trees and other areas, and robbed of their honey. This practice is still carried on in many parts of the world, particularly in the Asian area, where groups of bee hunters will go out for several weeks at a time, removing honey from Apis cerana and Apis dorsata nests, sometimes bringing back many hundreds of pounds with them. In later years, bee hunting became quite a sport, and is described quite clearly in a book by J.R. Lockhart in 1908. Equipment was even devised for the catching of bees, feeding them and then releasing them to see which direction they went, as in slide 2, waiting for them to come back for another load and thus moving closer and closer to the beehive. The third phase of the development was the use of log hives and apiaries. This slowly developed between the 1400s and 1900s. It is interesting that during this period or earlier, the same sort of development had taken place in many parts of the world. The melatonin bees in South and Central America were being kept in piles of logs, as in slide 3, by the Mayan Indians. Slide 4 depicts a single melatonin colony. Trees were set aside in Africa for hiving of swarms in logs, of which many would be hung in one tree, thus forming a local apiary. And slide 5 depicts such a collection of hives in Tanzania. Slide 6 depicts a close-up of one of the hives in the same tree, but unfortunately this slide is upside down. Other types of African hives are depicted in slides 7 from West Africa and 8 from Uganda, and slide 9 depicts one being manufactured in Kenya. In North Africa, the same type of beekeeping was carried on with clay pipes, as shown in slide 10, because timber was not readily available. In all of these areas, this type of beekeeping is still carried on, in some of them to a great extent. During this period, particularly in Europe, many attempts were made to develop better hives, slowly changing from logs to log-type skeps, to skeps, and then to skeps with storage areas. Slide 11 depicts a European log hive. Slide 12 shows a skep with a storage area. The fourth great step in the development of beekeeping took place between the 18 and 1900s with the development of movable frames. A sectional leaf hive is depicted in slide 13. Beekeeping equipment, film strip 10, development of standard equipment. The first movable combs likely evolved sometime before 1682 in Greece with the introduction of a top bar hive, round with sloping sides. Slide 14 shows the Greek basket hive. Slide 15 with the top removed showing the top bars. And slide 16, one of the frames held by Brother Adam. Unfortunately, this round type of hive must have frames of differing lengths, and therefore the combs were not interchangeable. However, about 1683, a similar hive design, but long with square ends, was developed in England, using sloping sides. It is a modification of this design which is presently used as an intermediate hive in Kenya. Slide 17 shows how this hive has been adapted to the peculiar behavior habits of the African bees and their predators. It has uniform length top bars, but otherwise the frames are similar to the type used in the Greek basket hive. Slide 18 shows a brood comb from one of these hives. In the wild state, honeybees may nest beneath a large branch of a tree, as in slide 19, or under the overhang of a rock, but usually the nests are found in cavities which are cool, dark, and dry, and which provide protection from their natural enemies. They will select cavities of this nature in any climate, the most common being a hollow tree. In hot climates, it has been observed that swarms show a distinct preference for nesting places 5 to 8 meters or more above the ground, which are cooler than places nearer the hot surface of the soil. The exceptions to this, however, are in treeless areas where they will nest underground in the coolness of large termite nests, as in slide 20, and similar holes in houses, garages, and verandas, where they will occupy boxes and other cavities near the ground. Strong colonies of bees with plenty of food can endure cold for long periods of time, as long as they are protected from the wind and from the dampness. If the nesting place for the bees becomes too hot, the bees have to spend considerable energy fanning and collecting water, and they become bad-tempered and abscond. The colony should have some protection from extremes of heat and cold, and provision for moist air to escape from their nest. There must also be sufficient room for brood rearing and storage of food reserves. Cracks through which bees cannot pass are usually sealed with propolis. Slide 21 shows a propolized bottom board entrance, with the brood chamber removed to show the extent of propolizing. If the entrance to the nest is larger than the bees can guard safely, they block it up with propolis, leaving only a number of holes which they can both guard and use to regulate and circulate the air in the hive. There are many variations of comb construction in the races of bees, and the various species found in various parts of the world. But for the European Apis mellifera, the combs in the wild, slide 22, turned upside down for better photography, are normally parallel to each other, and are composed of a central vertical midrib with hexagonal cells on both sides, the midribs being about 24 millimeters apart in the center of the colony where they maintain the brood. The average thickness of the capped brood is 24 millimeters, with spaces between the combs of 9 to 10 millimeters. The outer combs, which are used mainly for the storage of food and sometimes for raising drone brood, are more widely spaced, being 38 to 44 millimeters, or even up to 50. The combs are built down from the top of the nesting place and are attached strongly at the top, and usually part of the way down the sides, particularly if the opening has straight sides. If the container where the colony is located has sloping sides, the combs will be rounded, as in slide 22. It will have less weight, and the bees have not much tendency to fasten it to the sides. This would appear to be associated with the necessary support of the comb to hold the weight involved. The bees do not normally attach the comb near or at the bottom, but leave a gap of between 6 and 10 millimeters at the bottom of the nest. This gap, which the bees keep clear, is called the bee space, and is a very important feature in the construction of beehives. In modern frame hives, the bees are induced to build their combs in frames. The hive and the frames are constructed to very accurate dimensions, so that each frame is surrounded by a bee space, and the frames remain free in the hive for easy removal. Should the space between each frame or between the frames and the hive body be greater than 10 millimeters, the bees may fill the gap with burr or brace comb, as shown in slide 23. Or, if large areas are left, as in this case, they will build comb and fill it with honey, creating a very awkward problem for harvesting. Any gap less than 5 millimeters would, in time, be filled with propolis. It was Langstrauss' discovery of this fact, and his application of it to the design of hives, that made the modern frame hive possible. There are 3 main types of beekeeping equipment, as far as size is concerned, in general use. They are all interchangeable in that the width and the length are practically the same. However, the frames are not interchangeable, since the depth varies. These are the jumbo, the Langstraw, and the shallow dedant. These are described in more detail in the text. Slide 24 depicts an apiary in Mexico, which is made up of jumbo brood chambers and shallow supers. This is a common practice in many of the tropical areas, as the bees do not rear brood as intensively over a short time as they do in the more northern climates, thus requiring more manipulation and more brood space. A single jumbo-type brood chamber is usually sufficient to handle all the brood rearing necessary in tropical areas. The shallow super is very useful in that there is less breakage for removing it and taking it to the honey house for extracting, and it is easily removed with the repellent chemicals, blowers, etc. Slide 25 depicts the type of colony normally used throughout North America, which consists essentially of standard Langstroth equipment. In this way, everything is interchangeable. Swarm control consists mainly of interchanging the lower two brood nests periodically during the spring build-up period. There is a trend recently towards using 2 Langstroth boxes for brood nests, or even 3, and in some cases 4, and shallow supers for collecting honey. Slide 25 is a 2-box Langstroth hive with a standard telescoping lid, as described in the text. In this case, no alighting board was provided, but the bees were set on a piece of corrugated metal to keep grass away from the entrance. A cover of this type requires an inner cover to facilitate the examination of the colony. Slide 26 depicts such an inner cover in place on top of a colony being prepared for winter. In this case, the inner cover had a notch cut in one of the rims. During the winter, this cover is turned so that the notch allows the bees to have an upper entrance. During the summer, the board is reversed. Beekeeping equipment, film strip 11. Standard equipment. If a telescopic lid is used and no inner cover, it is advisable to cover the frames with a piece of canvas or sacking, as depicted in slide 27. Do not be confused by the number of frames that you see in this hive, as this photograph was taken in Siberia and Russia. Each country has its own standards and ideas as to how colonies should be handled. Beekeeping equipment must be carefully cut to exact measurements so that all parts fit accurately to allow proper bee space. It is also important that when the equipment is put together that it be nailed well and straight. There are a few aids in nailing equipment together which are useful. These are described in the text. The finished frame should look something like slide 28. This also depicts the vertical crimped wiring, which comes in some foundation. This foundation must be fastened in fairly tight at the top to hold the wires, and they should slip into a groove at the bottom so that the wires will not penetrate down through the bottom after long use. The cross wires are embedded into the wax by heat. In some manipulations of the colony, queen excluders are quite important. One of the best types is shown in slide 29. This is made of welded metal and is very accurate in measurements, so that only the worker bee can go through. These measurements will vary with different bees. Quite often in Africa, if a queen excluder is desired, it is made from 5 mesh to the inch coffee screen, as African bees are somewhat smaller than European type bees. The space is smaller still for Apis cerana. A table will be found in the text giving the measurements for the various bees. When the honey is removed, a useful piece of equipment is what is referred to as an acid board, on which carbolic acid or benzaldehyde may be sprinkled lightly, and then quickly drives the bees down off the honey when it is inverted over the supers. Details on its use will be given under Management for Honey Removal. This equipment consists of a lid to fit just over the box. It is covered with metal, which is usually painted black to absorb the heat from the sun and thus make it more effective. Under the metal is an absorbent material onto which the carbolic or benzaldehyde may be sprinkled. This is depicted in slide 30. Removal of honey can be made quite easy by the use of bee escapes. The most commonly sold bee escape is one called the porter escape, which consists of a piece of metal which can be placed in a hole in a wooden board. The bees go down through the hole in the top and then pass through wire springs which they can force open when coming through, but closes up, and so that they cannot return. Slide 31 depicts such an escape, slightly open to show the wires. The main drawback to this type of bee escape is that occasionally the wires will get plugged up with drones or dead bees, and the bees will not be removed when they are wanted. A bee escape which can be made at home is much more suitable and works faster, and does not have these disadvantages. This consists of a board as depicted in slide 32, which shows the upper side with the holes in each corner, down which the bees will pass. This has a cutout in the center with a double screen over it, so that the bees are attracted down much more readily. The underside of this board is shown in slide 33. This is the side which is directly over the brood chamber, or the super below the one to be removed. The bees go down through the round hole shown in the previous picture and enter this small screen area on the corner, and then pass out through a small opening. This opening is approximately 10 millimeters. Slide 34 shows a close-up of one of these corners. You can see the hole from above down which the bees come, and the screen, so that they are directed out through the opening on the corner. When moving bees, it is quite often necessary to have screens for ventilation. Slide 35 depicts the type of screens which are used. The one on the right is a tuck-in screen for the entrance, which can just be held in place with one or two thumbtacks, if the colonies are only going to be moved a very short distance in cool weather. This screen is just tucked in the entrance of the hive. For longer distances, however, it is necessary to use a screen on the top as well, as depicted on the left of the same slide. The finished colony, ready for moving, is shown in slide 36. The wires within the screen on the top are to hold clustering bees, which come up to the surface if the weather is very hot. When moving bees, it is necessary to bind them together tightly, and the best material to use is strapping wire, which is applied as shown in slide 37. The equipment necessary for this operation is shown in slide 38. This includes the snips to cut the wire, the tightening equipment to pull the wire very snug, and the clamps to be put in place and then snipped in place with the clamps. Where migratory beekeeping is carried out on a larger scale, quite often bees are loaded with no screens and no entrances being closed. They are loaded in the evening, and in order to facilitate these moves, special boom loaders are used. Slide 39 shows such a loader with the boom loader suspended over the load. We now continue the moving of bees with film strip 12. The bees from a boom loader are unloaded quite readily, as depicted in slides 40, 41, and 42. Slide 41 shows a group of bees being picked up from the truck by the loader. Slide 40 shows them being extended out on the loader to the area where they are to be put down, and slide 42 shows two colonies, one on top of the other, being lowered into position. This is a general practice where bees are moved extensively, such as in California, and especially for pollination purposes. For the hobbyist beekeeper, or the smaller operator who usually handles only 1 yard of bees, which are quite often located near his home, some gadgets for moving of equipment and bees around the yard are useful. Slides 43 and 44 show a wheelbarrow, which is a very handy unit for moving equipment back and forth around the bee yard. Slide 45 shows a special hive lifter, which is perhaps one of the best of the designs yet made. With this, you can move it right up around the colony and elevate the supers of honey off the colony, move it back while you examine the brood nest, slide 46, and then push it back into place and lower them back on the hive. This avoids a lot of heavy lifting when examining the brood nest during the honey flow. The important feature is stability in this unit is the wide wheelbase. Quite often in queen rearing, it is necessary to select certain queens from which you want to take larvae or eggs for grafting, and to have these readily available for the purpose. A special container of this type, as depicted in slide 47, is very useful. This is a box with queen excluder sides, which can be inserted into the brood nest and a frame put into it. The queen is then confined to one frame, and you know the exact age of the larvae by shifting the frame periodically. It has ready access by the bees, and therefore there is no interference with the brood rearing. Feeding of bees is rather important, both for sugar syrup for honey and pollen. Slide 48 shows the OAC pollen trap. Details will be given in the text. It is placed underneath the brood chamber. Slide 49 shows the parts of the OAC pollen trap by diagram, and slide 50 shows one under a colony. In slide 51, the pollen is being removed on the cloth tray from the back of the hive. Preservation of beekeeping equipment, particularly in tropical areas, is very important. While copper naphthenate, as discussed in the text, can be used, many prefer impregnating the equipment with hot paraffin wax at 100 degrees centigrade or much higher. Some mix this with 50% rosin. It is important that the equipment be submerged long enough for the hot wax to soak in, approximately 1 minute. It is allowed to drip and then dipped again. Others find it suitable to just pass the equipment through a heated tank of wax, as depicted in slide 52. Since this is both a dangerous procedure and a fire hazard, it should be carried on outside away from the buildings and carried out with great care. In slide 52, the firebox for melting the wax is below the wax container. We now continue with beekeeping equipment, film strip 13, other aids. The feeding of bees in both spring and fall is quite important. There are a number of ways in which feeding can be carried out. Perhaps the most commonly used feeder is a pail inverted over the colony with a few nail holes punctured in the lid to allow the bees to take the sugar through these holes. These lids should contain not more than 7 or 8 nail holes, or in some cases they can be purchased with perforated screen in the center. Since some protection is needed, these can be placed over a piece of tar paper which has been cut with a hole in it, as shown in 53, and then an empty box placed around it, and the lid put on top, as shown in slide 54. An alternate type of feeder is the box type shown in slide 55. This must have a means whereby the bees can come up from the colony and take the syrup down without getting drowned in the syrup. In this case, there are 2 places where the bees may come up. In some cases, only one place is provided, at either end or the side. It is wise to have a float of some sort in the area where the bees come up, so that they do not drown in the syrup. These boxes must be waxed on the interior. Emergency feeding may be carried on by pouring syrup into combs and placing them in the colony. In slide 56, this is being used for a nucleus. Quite often for emergency feeding, in the early spring, where it is difficult to get into a bee yard, a sack of sugar can be carried in. If very finely granulated sugar is used, this can be placed on top of a board or a piece of tar paper on the top of the colony, with an opening cut in the center, so that the bees can come up and take it down. The moisture from the colony liquefies the sugar sufficiently for the bees to take down the syrup, as depicted in slide 57. Slide 58 shows a standard smoker used for smoking bees. The best type to purchase is one with as large a fuel box as possible, making sure that the bellows work well. The smoker should be made of heavy metal or have an inner piece of metal which can be thrown away and replaced when it burns out. Slide 59 shows two very essential items for working with bees, especially if they are bad-tempered, such as during a robbing period in the fall or with African bees. The hive tool is a very useful item, but quite often they get lost in the grass too easily. To avoid this and to be able to locate them readily, it is wise to paint them bright colors which contrast with the green grass, such as yellow and red. The gauntlet-type gloves are very handy, and the ventilators can be seen in the upper part to make them cooler when operating in hot weather. Slide 60 shows the judicious application of smoke to a colony when it is first opened. The proper smoking of bees is extremely important. African bees are sometimes extremely difficult to work with, and slide 61 depicts a bellows-type smoker which can be hung on the side of the colony for ready use when needed, and has been developed for work with the African bees introduced into Brazil. An earlier version of this is shown in slide 62, without any bellows, but the box for burning the fuel is quite large, with a wide opening at the bottom, so that a good circulation of air will keep a steady supply of smoke over the colony. Getting up and down off the truck is sometimes a little awkward, and this device shown in slides 63 and 64 is one which has been developed in Australia to ease the step up. This can be supplied to a truck quite readily and is depicted off the truck in slide 63 and in place in slide 64. It is very essential to tighten up colonies and band them together when moving, and the little device shown in slide 65 is one that has been used to tighten up the band on the colony so that the bands are reusable. With the background of the previous chapters, we now turn to Chapter 5, Management of Honeybee Colonies. In field strip 14, production of honey from packaged bees is discussed. Packaged bees are generally recommended for making increase in eastern Canada, except where the major honey flow is in August. Packaged bees should not be relied upon to produce as much honey as an overwintered colony in eastern Canada, as they take longer to build up sufficient strength for honey production. In western Canada, where the days are longer, packaged bees seem to build up faster, and quite often the honey flow is a little later, starting than in eastern Canada. If the packages are introduced early enough in the season, then they can produce an economic crop of honey. Usually overwintered colonies are superior if the queens are good and they have come through the winter satisfactorily. A package of bees consists of a queen and approximately 1 kilogram of bees, 10,000 to 15,000 bees in total. They are usually shipped in wire screen cages with a feeder and a special cage for the queen. The parts are shown in slide 1. They arrive either by truck or by air, often fastened together by slats in groups of 5, as in slide 2, since they must reach their destination as soon as possible with no exposure to extremes of heat and cold. Slide 3 shows the queen in a separate cage and the feeder can in place with the bees. If the package of bees is to be established on foundation, as in slide 4, rather than drawn comb as in slide 5, the delivery of the package should be delayed until it is reasonably certain that the bees can collect pollen from the field. Usually this would be about the time of fruit or dandelion bloom. If combs are available with plenty of pollen, as in slide 6, and or honey as in slide 7, then the packages can be installed much earlier. There are 2 methods of introducing packaged bees, both of which give a direct release of the queen, which is rather important, as it overcomes the necessity of checking back to see if the queen was released, and it also gives her about 3 days earlier egg-laying time. In both methods of introducing packages, it is advisable to have drawn combs containing about 15 kilograms of honey and pollen reserves available. Cakes of pollen supplement made with soybean flour, you can find these in the text, may be placed over the comb, slides 8 and 9, if there is not sufficient pollen. The colonies may be fed with conventional feeder pails, as in slide 10, inverted over the frames if there is not sufficient feed. The first method is described as a spray and direct release method. The package of bees should be sprayed or otherwise fed, slide 11, with a 40% sugar syrup at intervals until they are gorged with syrup before they are introduced. Care should be taken not to brush the syrup on the screen, as it will injure the tongues of the bees. The deep side of the reversible bottom board should be used to provide more room for the bees when they are shaken in. 4 combs are removed from each hive, as in slide 12. Just before shaking the package is sprayed until the bees are wet with syrup. They are jarred into one end of the cage and the screen cut to permit rapid shaking of the bees into the hive, as in slide 13. When the bees are shaken into the hive, they should be spread out so that they will fit under the frames, so that the 4 frames removed can be replaced. The queen in the cage is then sprayed with syrup and released immediately on the combs, or with the bees, by removing the screen from the cage. The entrance to the hive is reduced temporarily. The spraying of the bees and the queens prevents their flying, especially during warmer weather. The colony should not be disturbed for at least 10 days to 2 weeks, as even if the queen is lost, little could be done in time to save the package, and a disturbance during the first 2 weeks can cause queen losses.